Okay, our next speaker is Stephen Peake. Stephen is Senior Lecturer in Environmental Technologies at the Open University. He's a Fellow of the Judge Business School in Cambridge, Fellow of the Royal Institute of International Affairs. He's worked with Shell International, the International Energy Agency of the OECD in Paris. He's been an official of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in Bonn. He's presented the BBC video programme Shanghai Boom, looking at energy options facing China, and he's been a consultant on the BBC Climate Chaos programmes, and he consults widely on issues related to energy and the environment and health. So thank you, Stephen.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I'm conscious that I've got to get through a number of slides which I prepared for you, and to communicate some messages to you in a very short time. And I think we want some time for discussion at the end of these two sessions. So with your indulgence, I'm going to sort of whiz through, and if something's too quick, we'll pick it up in discussion. So this is a fresh talk, actually, some fresh thinking here, because my brief was to try to look at the gaps, what it is that we don't know about the position we're in with energy and climate, and to put that to an audience who was beginning to think, or maybe has quite advanced thinking skills, in and around the areas of complexity science. So I haven't actually done this before, and I've come up with this talk to try and stimulate you to achieve the goal that you want to today. And if I had one slide that sums up my message, I would say this: the distinction between these two things on this slide, this is where there's a massive gap here between how we think the world is and how we think. And that's where all the risk and that's where all the opportunity is for creative thinking around the problem, this complex, wicked, messy set of nested problems that we face today. Any of you that have suffered personal relationship breakdowns will understand that when you have two sides, there are 2 points of view, and that this is extremely relevant. Any of you that think for just a second about any of the numerous regional conflicts which are taking place in the world and the different sides' points of view about the resource that they're struggling, about their history, about the ethics involved from their actual stance, you'll see that there's a massive difference between how somebody perceives the world and what they think. And that's your challenge. Professor Beddington is here this week saying that there's a perfect storm coming around food, water, climate change, energy. He's talking about 2030, and that's obviously the way the world seems to him today, and to many others. But I'm a sort of natural contrarian, actually. I've been doing this for 20 years, and when people start to describe the fact that we're going to hell in a handcart and it's all over, the contrarian in me flips, because I've been doing that message for 20 years, and now I want to argue the case that that's not the case. So I think it's important that we recognise that this is the way the zeitgeist is going. This in a way, we're creating a new worldview. There are many ways of perceiving reality. You, as an audience, more than any other, know about that, because often you get into the business of modelling, and how are we going to construct the model? And what is our approach to it? We can do it in lots of different ways, but right at the bottom here are these really quite important notions that sometimes that we just don't question about. It could be religious beliefs, it could be some other system, but a unifying worldview of what is so ubiquitous in the world today, we don't even begin to question it. And we are now at the cusp of a new worldview that transcends religions. In some senses it transcends politics. It's a new kind of systems way of looking at the world, and it is quite simply the low-carbon world. And I put it to you, actually, that we're right at the beginning of it. Even for somebody like myself, and I'm not one of the oldest people in the game. There are people who've been looking at building dynamic systems models of energy systems since the 1967 oil spike, price spike, since the 1973. I'm a relative latecomer. But even though we've had a group of academics that for one reason or another have been modelling and thinking, I don't think we are really very advanced at all in our ability to envision a low-carbon world. We're particularly good at talking about the impacts. We're particularly good at trying to frighten the pants off each other. But we're absolutely terrible at joining things up and actually putting together a convincing case for low-carbon scenarios. It's just not there. We're right at the beginning. And I'm not criticising anyone. I'm just saying that don't get too depressed, don't get too down about it, because I don't think we've even begun to unleash the creativity which we are capable of as a species. So in order to structure my talk, I came up with these 5 questions to get inside the mind's eye of international policymaking. I have a background, as Jeff said, in this. This is Michael Zammit-Cutillard in the background here. He was my boss. He was the executive secretary of the UNFCCC when I worked there. And this is the current one, Yves de Boer. And I know what it's like to sit up on that platform and to be one of the minions at the back, kind of the cog in the machine advising. I know the little notes that they leave on the tables, the leaders that come and give their speeches in the high-level segment. I have some sense of what it is when they get off the plane for the high-level segment and they think, right, I've got to engage now, I've got to move the international politics forward. These are the sorts of questions which policymakers ask themselves. And it's useful for us, for your purpose today, to kind of, let's think about some of the evidence. What have we got to answer these questions? What do we know already and where are the gaps? And that's the structure of my talk. So, what's going on? I think we're pretty good, actually, at describing what's going on. You saw this graphic of the lovely dance of Milankovitch and the Ice Ages in the last couple of million years. The Earth has been behaving itself in quite a regular pulsing rhythm, and there it is. And by rights, we should be heading about now into another ice age, but you know the story. We're not. We can look at the instrumental record. We can model, this is a model, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, of radiative forcing and a disaggregation of what the greenhouse effect is. I'll come back to that in some detail. We can think about the future. So this is the past, and this is from paleoclimate. This is very, very sound, beautiful science. Hold these ice cores, etc., etc. It's great science. This is measurement and instrumentation. This is modelling. And you can't see, but we're coming to a bigger version of that diagram. There's some error bars in there. This is scenarios, and so let's say this is a little different. What is happening? What's going to happen? This is the future. This is modelling. There's something completely different about that piece of evidence and this piece of evidence. And then there's another little bit, which is what are we actually observing at the moment? What is observed climate change? What can we actually see? So what's actually happening on the ground? So this is past, this is present, and this is future. They're all quite different, but quite good and quite beautiful. The IPCC is doing a wonderful job. Let's have a look, for example, at this, which is our understanding of what is causing, what are the factors which cause the warming which we're observing. And there are actually several factors. Some of it is to do with the increased concentrations of greenhouse gases up here. But there's some negative effects here to do with, for example, changing in land use patterns and albedo, the reflectivity of the Earth, the complex mechanisms through which aerosols affect the atmosphere, affect this equation negatively overall, but we're very uncertain about that. And overall, we think there's a sort of date timestamp with this. This is overall, we think, since 1850, that radiative forcing in the climate has increased by about 1.6 watts per metre square, plus or minus about a watt. And that is the core of our understanding of global warming and the effects we've had over the Industrial Revolution. However, okay, look at this. There's a lot of room here within science. It could be the warming that could actually have occurred could be quite a lot lower than this 1.6, or it could be quite a lot higher. And so here's the probability distribution function derived by the IPCC in a particular way, which I can't go into now, but this is their best guess now as to what the probability distribution function looks like for this value of radiative forcing. And you can see it has a mean here at 1.6, but you know it does have a spread, and this is important because if you're a climate modelling team and you want to model what might happen in the future, if you decide that in your model of the past you actually believe your model, or your model is calibrated so that the radiative forcing is down here, it's lower, you run your model cooler, that'll have a big difference in your projections of future climate change. If, on the other hand, you decide to run your model hot, then you'll produce, as a result of your modelling activity, much more interesting from the press's point of view, forecasts of what might happen. So what else do we know about what's happening? Well, we have reasonable statistics on a global basis about which sectors, where is the CO2 or other gases coming from, what is the historic longitudinal pattern in the last few decades, which sectors are the bad sectors, which sectors are the mysterious, not sure what's going on sectors. We can do that. That's one way that a policymaker might start to identify where do we put our energy, who are the troublemakers in the class. Well, they're quite clear from there. But you're a little bit more sophisticated. Everybody knows, and you know, of course, that when we build a model of emissions, climate change, we have population, affluence and technology, the Kaya identity, IPAT, however you know it. And we can become sophisticated looking at previous decades and say, OK, well, if this is actual decadal growth in emissions, what lay behind it? And in this case, we see that if we take this decade, 1970 to 1980, we had a global growth of just over 4 gigatons. Some of it was to do with income. People were getting richer overall. There was more population. However, there was a change in the fuel mix. And there was an overall change in the structure of the global economy. They decarbonised, the change in the relationship between overall output and overall energy use as technology and efficiency changed as well. And we can look at that for the 80s to the 90s, the 2000s, and we can begin to think what might happen in the future decades. So we sort of have a handle on what is happening, sort of. And then we ask ourselves, what's necessary? Well, when we ask a policymaker what is necessary, what do we need to do, we really are now in the world of modelling. And we're actually asking policymakers to do a risk assessment, a very, very, very complicated risk assessment, one which is a real problem and which I'm sure in the next few years you as a community, as complex systems models, are going to actually solve. But here's a very, very small example of a model, which is to say, OK, let's stick some emissions into the atmosphere, and then let's think a little bit more sophisticatedly about what happens to concentrations. We've got emissions to concentrations. What happens to radiative forcing overall? And what happens, to, for example, to temperature or some other climate response, sea level? Now, that's a pretty simple bit of an integrated assessment model, of a larger climate model. And it is still quite a task to do that accurately, and you come up with quite broad bands of uncertainty for various reasons. As the science kind of filters through, you can say, what if I absolutely knew emissions in the future? That's just a lie. Just play God and say that's the crystal ball. You can see that we don't actually know, for various reasons, what the actual climate response will be. I haven't even got into adaptation yet. I haven't got into human systems. This is something simple like temperature. Dead easy. Not. What does emissions into the future look like as far as the IPCC's view of the literature is? Well, it looks like a sort of computer cable that's been stripped and run over by a car tyre. And you've got many different modelling teams and many different model results, and here you are, you pick your future. What's it going to be? Is it some scenario which describes a low emissions future, or do you think a ruler is the best model here? Business as usual might be the case. What is? So some hapless teams of people in the academic community and in the IPCC do have the task of kind of understanding what the SRES report is and trying to understand, maybe assign probabilities to this, or maybe get behind some of this literature. And to date, this is a key point in my talk, to date, the way we've done it is by taking the universe of scenarios that exists and then identifying just a few scenarios that are distinctive, maybe in the way that their economic emphasis, or maybe here it is summarised with these broad shapes. Maybe some of them have high economic growth, some have lower, some have a complete lack of regard, perhaps this A1, F1, for the environmental constraints. Some are quite ambitious environmentally. Think about equity distribution, about which regions are growing and why and how do they share, what's happening to technology. We can come up with a sort of set of scenarios, half a dozen, which we can then give to these dozen or so modelling teams in the world, and we say, look, we've done the emissions bit for you. Okay, you don't need to get into that issue, because that's a whole modelling problem in itself. Just chuck these 6 scenarios into your model and tell me what you get. And that's precisely what the IPCC has been doing. But I think this is a core point for you. There's something very interesting about this moment we're in with scenarios. None of these scenarios, from what I understand, though there's some experts in the room, I'm sure, who may know better than me, we're delighted to hear from you. For example, population and overall economic output globally are completely exogenous to these models. These are quotes from the IPCC. What's more, none of the particular scenarios here have climate policies factored in. They're specifically factored out. Yeah? So you can do better than this in the next few years. And this is a rich seam of thinking, a rich area for you to apply your powerful tools of analysis to. So here's just another view of what's going on. I pick one of these emissions futures. Okay, these are the different scenarios. Here are different emissions pathways. By the way, we are up beyond the red line now. Actual observed since we did this diagram, we are beyond the wildest dreams globally right now. And by the way, a 50% reduction in global emissions, which they're going to be talking about in Copenhagen, or that sort of thing, that's below this dotted line you see here. So right now, just in just a few years, we're talking here and we're observing out here. So this thing is dynamic and it's changing. What you also see on this diagram is that if I pick my emissions future and then I run it through some models and I ask myself, well, what might temperature be for that particular future? Here we have our best guess, and then we have our range, 1.9 to 6 point something. And the reason we have that range is because we accept that we don't fully understand the science and that different models use different climate sensitivities and that there's a probability distribution function around what we know. So we can't say precisely, except that you can see broadly that the sooner we peak in global emissions and the faster the rate of decline, generally the lower the temperature. This is what science tells us. But that's a big unknown. We could be playing up here, we could be playing down here. This has a big effect as to whether or not you think, or how urgent you think this problem is. And this is new for the 4th assessment report for the IPCC. Climate sensitivity is a measure in a particular climate model. What does the model say is the warming that occurs for a doubling of CO2 from the pre-industrial 280 parts per million to 560 in a long-term stabilised 560. And actually you see on this, it doesn't have the key here, but the green is the models, and you'll see suspiciously they're all it's 3 degrees, because that's what they've decided, that's what we've been told to do. The red is the observed, and you can see, if we look at, and I don't fully understand what this means, it's not explained in sufficient detail in the IPCC, but what we observe in different places, I presume, is it could, the spread is here, however we're picking 3. So we're beginning to characterise climate models, we're beginning to understand and assign probabilities to climate sensitivity, which is a big step forward. It's particularly helpful if the press would understand that when they report this issue. So when you stick at the top line, we've got various emissions futures, and you can see if I take a higher one, you get higher concentrations, you get generally higher temperatures, and this bottom one is a sea level rise. Surprise, surprise. Although you'll see actually that sea level rise is fairly insensitive in the short term to whichever emissions future you choose. So, what else do we know? Well, there's a couple of diagrams here which do, if frightened the pants off me, actually. So this is European work, and it's the change from 1961 to 1971 or thereabouts for the A2 scenario. Let's just go back and have a look at the A2 scenario. That's here. So, I mean, they are choosing a sort of business as usual. This is a fairly scary scenario because we all want this or that, don't we? But okay, so if it is business as usual globally, then this is the change in temperature. Where do you want to live? Isn't it clear? If that's anything like reality, what's happening here at the moment? So that's temperature, folks. Precipitation patterns. West of Scotland is looking decidedly attractive despite the mosquitoes in the summer. But why does this matter? Well, this matters because all this modelling actually needs to. This is your territory, isn't it? Because you can do better than this in the next few years with complex systems modelling, because we need to kind of have a handle about temperature change and precipitation change so that we can get on to the much more important stuff, is understanding what are the systems connections between the economy, agriculture, etc., the ways that humans live, the resources we depend upon, the water stress, the flooding, etc., so that, for example, this is done for UNICEF, this particular diagram, so that, for example, we can get on and solve some of these issues to do with child poverty, malnutrition, etc. It's really important that we get this top, and the people who do that, is what I've just shown you, is the best knowledge we have about how these indicators change. And then we've got to flow these through and do the systems diagrams, build the models, to figure out, well, where do we put our money and how do we respond to this threat? And here's another example, very interesting, just what effect might climate have on US power grids? So let's build a model, yeah? And there we have a climate situation. These are sort of exogenous in this model. In we go, stick the IPC stuff in, and off we go. We'll figure out how to build our power network. So you can see many, many people are looking at the outputs of climate models, the climate science that we know, because it's like a kind of, it's like a baton race. We have to pick up the baton and then run through these systems and figure out what do we do, how are we vulnerable, etc. So, and if you kind of look at, this is an adapted from the IPCC fourth assessment report, temperature on the bottom, 0 degrees, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 degrees, and you can see that as the temperature increases, lo and behold, across all the different sectors, water, ecosystems, food, coastal health, and these large-scale discontinuities, the bad stuff, the Hollywood stuff, as the temperature rises, we broadly run greater, deeper, more comprehensive risks across these different systems. So that's the kind of that's the money shot that says, "Ooh, this is all very bad." What's possible? Okay, because
Stephen, can you finish in 5, please?
5, yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
So what's possible? Finish in 5. We have to decide how much money we want to spend on mitigation, how much on adaptation, how much residual damage are we capable, willing to cope with. That's a complex socio-technical, political, ethical question. If you've done that, well, then you just allocate the amount of money that you want to the climate problem, decide the balance between these 3 factors, and then, quite interestingly, you decide which is the best route. Is it legal? Is it markets, technologies, behaviours, norms? That's a big unknown that you have to deal with too. And you have to do all of that in an environment of decision-making, sequential decision-making under uncertainty. Because that's... So it's like, you've got to juggle and stand on a changing platform as it is. Now, this is a source of inspiration for you all, because if you look at the bottom-up, the literature survey of the literature, and you look at the sort of bottom-up studies of market and economic potential for, say, $100, what can we find? What savings? This kind of things that Dave was talking about. This is what technical goodies have we got? You actually see, if you look across the sectors, for $100, you can get, in each sector, by 2030, huge amounts of emissions saving. If you show this is very much an engineer's point of view. If you show it to project developers, I was with clients on Monday and Tuesday who are global construction firms who are constructing everything from links that were shown in those diagrams to cities in the desert. their project developers will laugh their head off, like the sort of smash robots at this, and say, well, that everybody knows in the real world that's not true. McKinsey do a similar thing, where you get the marginal abatement curve, showing that actually there's a huge amount of emissions potential which comes for nothing or free. And as you go up for something like $100, we can actually get rid of 27 gigatons of carbon out of the system really quite quickly. Of a system which has 32 gigatons at the moment. So these are all sources of great optimism, and something that we need to understand more fully is how do we achieve this in the real world? So climate modelling actually compounds a number of different models, a number of different modelling disciplines, each of which has got a history and is fairly ambitious. What's fair? Well, here's the classic image of what is not fair in the world. That we have here a group of countries, a group of people that emit per capita much more than these other people in these other places, and we have now, as we approach Copenhagen, to choose between 4 different views of fairness in the system. And this is what international policymakers are being asked to decide. Is it per capita? Is it polluter pays? Is it grandfathering? What is it? Is it some combination? What's actually achievable? This is very difficult. Now I'm going to do it. I just put it to you this, that we're actually stuck in the tracks at the moment. And it's for good reasons. Sound science is highly inertial. So is this process here. I wonder whether or not the international legal process, as it is constituted in the UNFCCC, is capable of dealing with the almighty row that's about to happen. If we had an international environmental court, which I believe we will, and a World Environment Organization, which I believe we will, and we actually change the institutions of global governance, I think we'll have a better chance. But if we have to rely on my friends here and my tired colleagues there, I think it's asking too much of one convention. 20 years since the IPCC, I'd argue 20 years is actually a very short time in the climate system, but at the moment it's a very long time in terms of the threat that we're told and the urgency with which we need to act, and therein lies a problem. Another key message, I suppose, is this. If you talk to economists, they'll tell you for $100, $200, say a carbon tax, that much of this is achievable. And I do believe that, actually. I think that the real problem is persuading people that the carbon taxation approach, or it could be through cap and trade, that it's not medicine, it's actually where we want to go. That a greening of the taxation system actually will result in a world, a more sustainable world, a better world, a more beautiful world. That's the task that we have right now. And at the moment we're losing the battle. Nobody really sees it like this. And that's up to some of my colleagues. I love this curve, the declining productivity of complexity. It's the curve behind Jared Diamond's book in Collapse. You all know it's true of organisations, and you know it's true of systems, and you know it's true of nations. There are marginal benefits becoming more and more complex until you reach the point of the Vogons in the Hitchhiker's Guide kick in, and they want everything in triplicate, and all of a sudden, like the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, it all goes wrong because we've had too much bureaucracy. Thank you very much. A bit like higher education. Right now, here's a challenge to you. I think we're coming back to the 60s. I think that Buckminster Fuller's ideas are once again quite relevant, and I think the notion that what we miss in this whole equation is a sense of complexity and design, and that we can challenge some of the findings of the IPCC and think, no, and the literature that they rely upon, we can do better than that. It's up to you to change the literature so that we can change the world. Don't confuse decision nodes and chance nodes. And when I talk to governments, business, individuals, community leaders, they often confuse where they are. Depending on whether you think you're a chance node or a decision node, whether you have that capability, depends on your view of the world and who it is that's not pulling their weight, or whether or not your small actions are futile. The work of my colleague Professor Roy at the Open University tells us that green design, making mouse mats out of recycled rubber car tyres, thank you very much. I hope none of you are doing that. That's just step one, okay? But what we're offered with the prospect of sustainable innovation and design is real radical, real system, real sustainable innovation. For that, you need to be able to see. You need to be able to see the world in a different way, not just the way you think it is. You've got to be able to understand the difference between how it is and how you think it is. And, that's the challenge that we've been set. And this is my last slide. I've just talked a bit about carbon. I didn't really talk about adaptation because we were talking about mitigation strategy. But the climate change problem is carbon plus adaptation because we're committed to a certain amount of damage already, disruption. But it's also all the other aspects of sustainable development because carbon's we've got food, we've got water, energy, health. So we've got the design brief is all of that, okay, which is the old famous 3 pillars. But to do it in an environment of sequential decision-making under uncertainty because we don't know what we're going to get thrown at yet. There's never been a greater modelling challenge. There's never been a greater design challenge. There are huge risks and there are huge opportunities. So I'm sure you'll sort it out. Thank you.
That's absolutely great. Thank you very much. Can I ask you, David, to come up? Okay, I think we've been given an awful lot to think about. And
Apologies.
No. I think that is good because we needed that information at the beginning. And I hope that you'll take the opportunity over coffee and lunch and so on to speak both to Stephen and to David because there's an awful lot that we did not cover. So any questions? Yes.
Thank you very much, Stephen. That was great. In the various things that have been talked about, we've talked about human adaptation and policy adaptation and so on. Is there a view about how much the Earth, the climate collectively may self-regulate or go through a flipping tipping point? Because it seems to be we're saying that the climate overall is relatively benign and relatively stable, just going on a trend. Is there any thought that it might suddenly flip into a different way, as it has done in the geological past?
The work of Tim Lenton at the University of East Anglia on tipping elements is superb, and if you haven't read that work, I recommend it to you. And that lists the various tipping elements according to temperature increase. And so we get the collapse of the Greenland ice sheet as one of the earliest ones. The collapse of the Greenland ice sheet, which is highly probable at temperatures of 2 to 3 degrees, we think, in and of itself may not cause the Earth to flip, as you say, into a major discontinuity. It will have a big effect, but it's not like some of the other things that might come down the line. If you read the IPCC work in great detail, you see that the probability of these discontinuities happening is absolutely negligible. And yet Hollywood and the press are obsessed by them. So this is a great example of what is, what the difference between what is and how you think the world. You all think that we are on the cusp of something really discontinuous almost immediately. And the IPCC, not me, I don't know the answer, but the IPCC in detail says absolutely the opposite. We are not. So...
No, there's a question here first, yes. And then back to you.
Are we on?
Yes.
Is it on?
Yeah, it's only for the video.
Oh, okay. Tim Foxton from the University of Leeds. Thanks for 2 very interesting talks. I want to just raise the issue of path dependency and lock-in. I mean, clearly at the moment, it's one of the lessons from complexity that we're locked into this high carbon system, both in terms of the technologies, the institutions, the strategies, and so we've got to break out that lock-in. But in terms of going forward, there's obvious path dependencies, and we don't know exactly where we want to get to. And so, how do we combine learning, which we've got to do, with not knowing where it is we want to get to? And one obvious example, Dave talked about the centralised and decentralised. I mean, is it possible to have both a centralised supergrid and the local distribution, or do we have to make a choice? So.
We've not been spectacularly successful in the past, have we? We tend to go for the cheapest option. I mean, but then often get that wrong. I mean, this is what worries me, that there aren't any precedents for action on this scale. Wars and things like that, which are always tragic, which if you have to look at the details, make terrible mistakes, they sort of get resolved. But we're talking about a campaign on a vaster scale than warfare.
So the answer is we need experimentation. We need experimentation immediately, quickly. We need to spend money on that. I mean, if we get an agreement on forests in Copenhagen, if that's all we get, and I suspect that if we get that, I'd be terrifically pleased myself. I think we need to deal with the forest issue. And that's an experiment, because we'll then be experimenting with an institutional system. We'll have said, yes, let's do it. Let's reduce deforestation. But whether or not the decisions that we actually take will result in a reduction in deforestation will need to be measured. I mean, just like the CDM, etc. But this is the timeline over which the IPCC has been telling the world that there's a problem. These are global emissions, and of course underneath here you've got the crossover between Annex 1 and non-Annex 1. Of course it was all our problem, and now it's a kind of shared problem around here. But look, there's only so much we could, this is 20 years. It's a short time in terms of international law. Yeah? It really is. International law does not work quickly. And I could go into the details of these nodes here. So we somehow need to find some money, easy, and find some will and some opportunity. And that's when I talk to organisations who believe they're a decision node, some of the bigger players. They're now thinking of moving to an organisational response level where they commit at board level serious amounts of money, where they begin to experiment. And so it's experimentation. It's just doing by learning. Because talking, we need it, but it is just talking. We've got to get on with it.
Question for Stephen. You refer to the wide range of scenarios, and obviously that means there may be problems with the modelling. But could an alternative lesson be that we are simply entering a period of greater instability, and the model somehow reflect that?
Yes, it is, and we are in a very we know essentially what you're saying is we know there's a number of drivers, key drivers of what emissions could be, and that they're interrelated, and that the system's slightly chaotic, slightly dependent on initial conditions and future conditions, etc. But then we go about our modelling by saying, 6 degrees doesn't have an effect on population. Huh? 6 degrees doesn't have an effect on global economic output. Come on. I'm being a bit disingenuous here, because I do know, behind the IPCC and the work of Nakashenovich and others is great, solid work. But the way that it's got used in the modelling community and the way that the media are projecting it, it doesn't allow us to have optimism and hope about the economic system, the way it's just got mangled up. It's not because they aren't clever enough or you aren't clever enough, it's just that somehow we've got sidetracked. And I don't have the skills to do it, but some of you guys do.
Okay, I've got 4 questions, and I think we'll need to have fairly short. At the back, Peter, there, and finally. Right, could someone pass right at the back, please? Thank you. And I should have said earlier, can you say who you are and where you're from, please?
I can. I'm Peter Miles from Complexity Solutions, and it's a question for Stephen, or a point really. Your very first point, the very big point, was about essentially people having different worldviews and perceptions, and that being key to the whole issue. But then during your talk, you said several times a point along the lines of perhaps the people in the room can help with the modelling. And my view of complexity is there's a very broad spectrum of complexity thinking, and there are modelling people, and there are people who are much more involved in social complexity and helping people to think things through in different worldviews. And perhaps that end of the spectrum is going to be more important than the modelling end in the near future.
Yes, I absolutely agree. And in my little list of models, which I agree I was going at 200 miles an hour then, but look, I've got business models, political models, social models, and policy models. Yeah, what the hell? Sincerely, they belong here. And right now, the spotlight is on these guys. We haven't even got many. We haven't got truly integrated assessment models right now to actually help UNICEF or whoever it might be that needs to know how to deal with child. We've got some, but they don't deal in probabilistic assessments of climate change. They work in particular. We need a lot more money spent very quickly here. It's that stuff by Chris Hope and others who are beginning to look at risk and put risk into these models so that we can actually have a more true and honest representation of the kinds of realities we might face. But you're absolutely right. Down here, and I'm working very carefully, when you like this large engineering construction company, we have organisations that are beginning to understand this, beginning to understand that risk and opportunity is there. They're changing their behaviour, And what happens if these guys do change? Well, lo and behold, this lot have got to pick it up because it's not currently in their baseline. So I absolutely agree with you. And, it's my ignorance of who you are as a complexity community is, who is actually in the room and who is not, whether or not you're more quantitative or qualitative. But you're all needed.
Exactly, absolutely. Yeah. Peter.
Yes, I just wanted to stress the point that part of the problem is that there's a misconception about what models are and what they do. The idea coming from traditional science that they are predictive things, and even when you add uncertainty, you're still thinking it's predictive, whereas in reality they are things to help us think about possible futures. And as I've often sort of said, the point is the more credible a climate change model is leading to disaster, the more probable it is that it might not happen because people will respond. So modelling becomes part of the game. And we need to also try to model the whole thing as well, if we can. I mean, to get some idea of how the changes will affect different agents and so on. But that is, at the moment, we're beyond that. We're still playing this game where we make these predictions and they affect people and governments and so on.
Absolutely.
So, can you summarise for David, please? Are you okay?
Yeah, it's about reflexive, that modelling occurs in a sort of reflexive... Yeah. There's a reflexive kind of meta model of what actually goes on. And you take a story like carbon capture and storage, where I've never seen so much money go on a horse so far out before the horse has even been entered into the race, let alone born, I think, actually. And there's that's a particular game being played around urgency and back this technology.
Yes, I'm Paul Eakins from King's College London, and I'm interested really in this interaction between technology, economics and politics, which Dave spent quite a long time on. You got to at the end. And coming right back to your first remarks about the way you see the world, I do technology, energy system and economic modelling, and it's perfectly clear to me, and you mentioned carbon taxes quite explicitly, that even for a relatively small open economy such as the UK, a shift in the tax system towards carbon taxation would be perfectly feasible in economic terms and would stimulate enormous low-carbon investment if it was of the order of $100 per tonne CO2, which is the kind of scale you were talking about. So in terms of technology and economics, there is not really a problem. The problem is that it would increase the cost of high-carbon activities to a very considerable extent. And the way most people think the world is that high-carbon activities are an absolutely essential part of living anything that resembles a good life. And my question really relates to those who are interested in the behavioural change side of this, which is that, is there any precedent for behavioural change of the scale that we're talking about, given that it's only 25 years ago that we were entirely committed to, for example, the great car-owning democracy, to mention one political slogan that had some resonance at the time, for these behavioural changes to take place over something less than a wartime kind of climate, which we won't get into until, if it's induced by the climate, until it's way past too late to do anything about it.
That was a question to the room, I think.
Yeah, I mean, this is precisely why the technology fixes are attractive, because they reckon to be able to have more hard-edged, they happen short time, you can avoid having to face up to some of these social changes. But, of course, you do need the two.
Well, I mean, the point I was making, really, is that the technology change will only come about through the carbon price, through that the investment into low-carbon technologies that will not happen unless it's driven by a strong price signal. And that carbon price is politically infeasible because of the high-carbon behaviours that people are extremely attracted to.
And the loop's closed. Right.
It depends on what behaviour. When people talk about behaviours, I wonder what they're talking about, because, if it's about having a heating system in your house, there are things we can do, relatively simple things, to redesign houses to have more insulation, etc., different properties, not bother putting the boiler in, have other things. And maybe they might have to adjust their living from walking around naked every room of the house during midwinter at 21 degrees, which is we've only had a taste for naked winter living in this part of the world just for the last 3 or 4 decades. I mean, I live at 16 degrees, partly because my boiler's bust and I don't want to fix it. At 16 degrees is about the limit for typing, and also about the limit for teenagers, if you've got teenagers, because they rebel below that. So I think we can give up habits like spatial heat, expectations of spatial heating. The car business, as Dave, electric grids, super grids, electricity. I'm very, very, very optimistic about cars and their fuel systems. If you mean aeroplanes, I mean, it's a question of which are the behaviours that are preventing, which are the things the policymakers, the politicians are so afraid of that they won't accept this good sense. It's not a medicine. It's not a pill that we're asking them. And I think you know that, Paul, more than anybody. We're not saying this is an awful pill, just take it and it'll all be all right. We're saying, look at this beautiful, lovely milkshake. If you drink this, drink that.
High cholesterol milkshake.
But how do we do it? Because I believe this. I believe this. But you
believe it because that's the way you view the world.
Yeah.
Most people don't. And
I know.
That's why it looks very like a pill.
It looks like a pill.
I think, yes, the next one is, yes. And I think that needs to be the last one, actually, yeah.
Jane Corbett from the Open University, and it's a question for Stephen, because apologies, David, I missed your talk. I hope I'll catch up.
You missed your talk?
Yeah, my apologies.
Can you do it again?
It'll all be all right on the night, yeah.
Great. OK, so it's really thinking about some of the very interesting points you raised about the need to get on with learning by doing and the experimentation. How can we make sure that we can learn very quickly from what we do, from that experimentation? How can we get the feedback from what we're doing, given that the modelling work is complex and there's still a huge amount of uncertainty built in there? And how can we communicate that quickly so that we can keep moving towards some kind of shared vision of what that future low-carbon economy and society is going to look like?
I don't know the answer. When I went to the IEA, the answer to everything about learning was to have a database and a website. Websites were new in those days, and we'd spend millions and millions of dollars on a website. They say, it's a website, and it's a database. And I used to be in charge of databases under the UNFCCC, and they used to call them, euphemism, clearinghouses. What we need is something like the IEA Greenhouse Database, and we'll have a clearinghouse where the learning will take place. Except we all knew that they weren't clearinghouses, they were bottlenecks. They were designed to actually stop the transfer of information in the system. That's a very cynical view of them anyway. But better sharing of knowledge is reflective practice of sharing of knowledge, however, is challenging to do. But I don't really know. Does anybody else have an answer? If we do get as far as experimenting, how can we learn? Because experimentation is not the same as learning.
I mean, I said earlier about warfare, isn't it? I mean, operational research, OR, started out in this area. Is it best to bomb places flat or deforest the areas? Over to Vietnam, they deforestation. War's like an inversion of what we're trying to do. That's it. How to deal with climate change? Deforest. Oh, no, we go the other way. Reforest. Yeah. Or do you use massive, I can't think of what bombs are the equivalent to, but hard technology, or do we use propaganda? Is it cheaper to send bombers with propaganda leaflets out and change people's attitude, spend all your effort on getting people to love low temperatures? I was brought up without water, gas, electricity, toilets, whatever. The house I lived in when I was 18, up to 18, had no services at all, and we didn't notice. Never worried us. I never remember thinking we are deprived. When at actually 15 we moved to a council house which had switches on the wall. I spent the first week going click, 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 and flushing the toilet sort of thing. So, can you put the toothpaste back into the tube? I mean, until that point, if anyone said, you are seriously deprived in a little Welsh hillside village, you haven't got running water. No, I said, no, we're not. It's lovely, beautiful, and because there are endless reality TV shows now saying how wonderful it would be to go back to Victorian times. And it probably would be if we could do it. So this, I mean, it's the answer to Paul's question. Can we run the machine back? Can we make people value things which now we think as, no, that, you know, I couldn't live without a colour TV now. 20 years ago, if someone said, do you want a colour TV? I said, well, not really, not interested. But now it's, you know, is there an entropy of behaviour? That's the trouble.
It's a good question, thank you. I'm sorry, it's a difficult one to answer.
It is.
It's a key question.
And it is a key question. And I'm sorry I cannot take any more of the questions because we have already run over quite a lot. There is, again, tea and coffee and croissant and biscuits next door. Can I please ask you to be back in here by 22? We have to make a start exactly by 1:45 because Alan does have to leave to go to an AHRC meeting. So, but before you go, please join me to thank both our speakers because I think they gave us a wonderful. Thank you very much.